So, Jim, appreciate you joining us. And I know you're a busy guy. I'll give quick background on myself. Jason Belzer, CEO of Student Athlete NIL. We're an agency based in Atlanta that focuses on working with brands that are entering the name, image, and likeness space, as well as universities in their activation and empowerment of student athletes. Jim, I'd love some background and if you can tell us a little bit about Influencer, and I'd also love to know how the company has evolved in the last 8 months of NIL.
Well, I appreciate Influential having us here. They've been a wonderful partner for us here in the NIL era, as has Student Athlete NIL. And Jason, it's great to talk to you today. You know, Influencer really began for me, at least in my brain, in the mid-2010s when the O'Bannon case unfolded in the Supreme Court. And to me, at that point, NIL was not a matter of if, but when. And so we launched Influencer in 2017, really with one clear mission for our product and our users, which are athletes. And that is to help athletes build their brand on social media. This is pre-NIL 2017. Social media obviously is already a big thing, but you know, making money is not optional for student athletes at that time with their name, image, and likeness. We built an app that allows student athletes to access content and the rights to share that content to their social media channels, like in Instagram and Twitter and Facebook. And we built a business for 3 years, really selling that product to colleges who pay us annually for the technology to provide content to student athletes they can share to social. It helps them grow their following, but helps the school reach a lot more people, and really got us a daily user in the student athlete that we knew once NIL began, we could provide new products, new features to not only allow them to build their brand, but allow them to build and manage their NIL business. And so you asked, you know, last 8 months, what have we seen? We launched 2 products last year. One, an Influencer Verify, to help athletes report all their transactions to their compliance department, providing them also with education, short videos and articles on all the topics they need to learn about with NIL, like brand building and financial literacy. But we also launched Influencer Plus, which comes with an exchange that allows global companies and local companies to really contact them and be able to talk to them about NIL opportunities and even pay them through the Influencer platform, which automates reports for tax purposes and for compliance purposes. So we're really helping student athletes build their brands, but also helping them build and manage their NIL business. And the data, gosh, from the last 8 months that has come through our system, 8 figures of NIL deal flow from all sports, all student athletes at more than 220 Division I and Division II schools that we serve. It's really been telling. And I know we're going to talk about that a little bit today, but I think, you know, we're in the first 400 meters of a marathon, and there's a lot still to unfold, but there's a lot that's happened as well.
Sure. And I want to talk about that data here in a minute. Where I want to start really is looking at legislative process. So July 1, NIL becomes a reality. The NCAA is essentially forced to pass some sort of legislation allowing student athletes to monetize their name, image, and likeness. You have a bunch of states that had enacted laws that some went live July 1, some thereafter. And now here we are 8 months later, and there's still no federal codification of law. The NCAA is a little bit antsy about how some of these deals are being done. And now we see states like Alabama and soon Florida repealing laws. So talk to me about, from a legislative standpoint, how this has kind of gone down, and also how you guys have maybe navigated that process or helped institutions navigate.
Yeah, so as you know, a guy trying to run and plan a business in this landscape, you know, venture capital backed, I'll admit it's a very potent and opportunistic market, but it's also, because of what you mentioned regulatory wise, one that you have to try to learn on the fly and react to those learnings on the fly with, because you know, we're serving more than 200 institutions, more than 4,000 teams in almost 50 states. And every institution, not every state, every institution looks different right now, because the institutions have been called upon to set their own NIL policy. Now, if you're an institution in a state that has an NIL bill, your policy as an institution has to adhere to the state's NIL bill, which creates a little more tightness in what you can and can't set in your NIL policy, because the NCAA, who said they were going to set these rules back in April of 2020, when they released recommendations for NIL regulations, never did. And the reasons that they didn't do that have to do with risk on their end and setting rules that could be looked at as limiting to the student athlete. We won't get into that. You're the lawyer anyways, you could explain it better than me. But that risk caused them to pass the buck to the schools with a waiver. And that waiver basically said NIL is now allowed. The bylaw that said it wasn't has a waiver to it. But you can't do it with recruiting inducements, which obviously even before NIL, it was already becoming a part of recruiting because every school has brand power. They have corporate sponsored dollars that show that brand power in a volume stat that you can look at. And student athletes now are going to try to either capture some of that volume or capture additional volume that in recruiting, the discussion is going to come up, right? So schools were forced to write their own NIL policy, some of which didn't have state bills and didn't think they would have to do that. And they had like a week before July 1st of last year to come up with that policy. And what you see now across the board, if you're sitting in my seat, is like, it's apples to oranges, not just by division or conference, but even within conferences. Schools are all looking at this differently. And one big point I want to make, and I felt like it was important for some of the viewers to hear that, brain dump of what's happened, because there's even more to it, but it's important to understand how we got here. But the reality is this: if you're a student athlete and you get hurt, who do you go to? You go to your school, and they have a trainer and eventually a team doctor if you have to get surgery. If you're a student athlete and your grades are suffering, who do you go to? You go to your school, and they have a tutor and academic resources to help you get your grades back on track. I could keep going, but the point is this: as a student athlete, you are going to a university expecting your school to provide people and resources to help you with every part of your student athlete experience. And yet NIL, because of these non-facilitation clauses that schools have in their policy, is ending up having to require not just tech companies like us. We'd be needed regardless, even if the school could facilitate deals. You need tech to do all the reporting around it, to facilitate the connections and conversations, but there's still human services required that are happening now with outside entities. Collectives of donors are coming in with money and some services to help facilitate deals. Local agencies focused on schools are coming in. There's a lot of outside entities, and because of that, there's a lot of confusion for the student athlete. They don't know who they should work with, who they shouldn't work with. And at the pro level, which is the only place NIL has ever been done before this, at least in sports, pro athletes have agents and they have a players association. Two things that 99% of college athletes don't have: an agent, and 100% of them don't have a players association. And they also have less time in college because they go to class. So there's a lot of problems with NIL around this non-facilitation aspect of college athletic departments that is providing opportunities for outside entities, but also really, I think, hurting the student athlete.
Makes sense. So let's get into some of these deal numbers. You talked about the fact that you guys have had 8 figures worth of deals come through the influencer platform over the last couple of months. Where are the interesting numbers here? What are the sports that are driving the most amount of dollars? And has there been anything that you didn't expect maybe necessarily coming into July 1 when things went live?
Yeah, I think, for us, the reality that, without football, women are actually transacting more than men has been really interesting. I think a lot of people, obviously with football, it's 59% in our system of transactions have been done by men, whereas 41% with women student athletes. But it changes when you take football out of the equation. I think that shows that after the fact with football, women are really active with their NIL, and I think that's going to grow. And I think that the other big thing is the average transaction size started just over $1,000 and has grown to more than $1,500 in 7 months. And so it's consistently gone up. I think it will plateau, but I think that student athletes learned early on that there are ways to drive down their value, and they need to be picky with what they do. I think they could still be a lot better than they're acting right now. The median transaction is merely $51, and 2/3 of the transactions are cash deals, but 1/3 are in-kind deals, meaning that the student athlete's given a product or food or something in exchange for their services other than cash, which they have to pay taxes on next month, by the way, or 2 months from now. I don't think most of them realize that. They get a free meal, they have to pay taxes on that $20 meal. But, so these things are all interesting. I think they're all showing growth, right? When we started, the number of men versus women transacting was a bigger split. It's come closer and closer together. When we started, the transaction size was 33% lower than it is today. When we started, the average transaction was 50% lower than it is today. Median transaction, excuse me. So I think that it's growing, and I think the student athletes are going to become more sophisticated as time goes on. And I think that's what the data is telling us. Last thing I'd say is not everybody is making money with their NIL. I mean, this is a new opportunity. And I think, unfortunately, the media really butchered this when they wrote about it. They really did a poor job of setting expectations with student athletes, and they hyped it up to the fans, who all thought, just like student athletes, that on July 1st, everybody was just going to make a bunch of money. And when you write your NIL stories on Zion and Trevor Lawrence, it's easy to think that. But there's 500,000 student athletes, and 499,000 of them at best are going to make a few $1,000s a year. And that's okay. That's a great opportunity. They're working a muscle that they're going to need to work a lot when they leave college athletics and go into the business world or do whatever they do. So it's great for that purpose too. 1,000 athletes are going to maybe make, 5 figures a year, and 10 athletes are going to make 7 figures a year, and there's going to be a few athletes that make 6. But that's the reality of the picture. And when you do all those numbers, it's a multi-billion-dollar market, but per athlete, we're talking about thousands of dollars. And at some schools, you make more than what you're going to make with your NIL working at it with just getting your new educated related benefits check that you're allowed to get, or your cost of attendance check. So I just think that that's important to understand. This is a job, and you get out what you put in the same way as you do with a 4.0 GPA or a scholarship to make the team. It's not just money that shows up in your bank account. Student athletes have had to learn that the hard way as this market's evolved.
Sure. So why is it that big brands haven't jumped in as quickly as some of us have thought? You haven't seen the major brands, that even the endemic brands that are sponsoring college sports simultaneously, the Cokes and Chick-fil-A's of the world, haven't touched NIL. And it seems like maybe that's where the big money is waiting to come in, or are we ever going to see them at all get involved from an image like
We're going to see them, but there's 2 big issues. It's a great point. And you see it in what you do with student athlete NIL to help these brands enter this world. I mean, you're wonderful at, you understand the athletes and you understand the teams, and now you can help these brands enter in a way where they can understand these athletes don't have agents. So if they are going to activate with a brand you're helping in, they don't know which shirt to wear. They don't know what angle to take on the camera. There's no agent in most cases because there's not enough money to command the services of an agent. But that's a separate topic. What you're talking about has 2 big aspects to it. Number one, NIL got off the ground last year in a very confusing way for everyone. And it happened in the middle of the year. And those companies have budgets, and their budgets were not set. A lot of them thought NIL was only going to happen in a handful of states, and the rest of the states, those schools in those states weren't going to be able to do NIL until there's a federal bill. Well, now we've seen that's not true. And they got to watch for 6 months what happened. And I think a lot of them will start to enter this year with a budget because they got a full fiscal year. There is a difference in college sports. The fiscal year is not always, but a lot of the times July 1st to June 30th, because that's when the academic and athletic year runs. In these businesses, they run off a January 1st year in most cases. And so we started NIL July 1st because it was a new athletic year, but that's not the beginning of the year for these companies. So I think that's one reason. The second reason, which is much bigger, is these companies have come into this world for years now through these media deals that the conferences are doing with, Fox or ESPN, or through the schools and their multimedia rights holders like Playfly and Learfield and the others that the schools are selling the right to sell advertising for the institution. That's how Chick-fil-A and Coke are coming in. And those outfits are not motivated yet because of the way things are structured, because of the deal facilitation limitations on the school, which the multimedia rights holder has those same limitations because they make money from the school. They're limited in basically, they're limited and not incentivized. Two important things in doing this to Coke. Hey, you work with our institution and you're buying these inventories with signage in the stadium and the Jumbotron video and the university website. We got some new inventory. You can actually add to your deal by activating with the quarterback, with 3 field hockey players that are influencers on social, with 2 softball players that made the World Series last year, and this basketball player. Would you like to do it? There's no continuity. So the relationship that the school through the multimedia rights holder has with Coke is fragmented from what could be a relationship for the student athlete. Right. And that's just another problem with the deal facilitation limitations that the schools have in their policy that needs to be solved, because it's an easy way to add inventory to existing sponsor relationships.
Right. But wouldn't there be a conflict in that sense? Even if there was an opportunity to do that, it's in the best interest of the school to maximize their dollars before they spread it out to the student athletes.
I think schools have realized that their dollars come directly and indirectly in many different ways. And recruiting is very important to drive revenue, because the better athletes you get, the better they're going to play on the field, the more tickets you're going to sell, the more advertising's worth, et cetera. And I think schools have learned, you know what? We've done this without athlete inventories, made some money. Our MMRs made some money, not at all places, but at a lot of those places. And by the way, I don't think that what I'm saying is consistent past the top 30 schools. Right. So I probably should have said that earlier. But in the top 30 schools of the Power 5, some people are starting to call it Division 0. The SEC will say this works because the schools get a big check from the media revenue share and the conference. They are doing well with their MMR now. And if the athletes can make some money from the same sponsors and it helps with recruiting, I think they're very happy with that.
Right. So there's been obviously there's a vacuum there, and that vacuum is being filled with what we see or call these collectives. Can you give a little bit of background? What is a collective? How are they operating? Where are they coming from? Give us some background.
So collectives began emerging. First time I saw a presentation, or I get decks sent to me from all kinds of businesses in this college sports world all the time. And I think the first time I saw a deck with the concept was like Q2 of last year, before NIL started. And I remember kind of how I felt, honestly, when I saw it, which was, that's interesting. So donors can pool money together and activate those dollars through an LLC. Some are trying to do it through a nonprofit entity to be able to write off the donation. Some are doing it through just an investment into the LLC, sometimes with a guaranteed return, sometimes without one. Once the LLC has those dollars, they can activate the dollars a lot of different ways. They can activate it directly through, setting up an event where the student athlete makes an appearance, which is technically NIL. Could be a dinner, could be a speaking engagement, and they get paid for it. Some are indirect through a nonprofit that already exists. The entity makes a donation and a nonprofit hires the athlete for an appearance. Through a business that already exists, the entity makes a donation or an investment, and the company that exists pays the athlete for, a lot of times it's an appearance, not always, but a lot of times. So that is, a broad version of what a collective is. You can, come up with a lot of other scenarios, but ultimately the money's coming from supporters, donors of the institution to help athletes realize their name, image, and likeness in a creative way. There are other collectives that are probably not, they shouldn't be called collectives. They should be called local agencies. An example of that would be Valiant at the University of Michigan, where they've been called a collective sometimes, but ultimately they're a separate entity from UM. They set up a shingle in Ann Arbor with space to shoot content and monetize that content with brands, with a space to print t-shirts and sell them at the bookstore with athletes' likenesses involved. They're grinding. I mean, these guys are working 80, 90, 100 hours a week. They played football at Michigan. They have relationships in Ann Arbor, and they're helping local and even sometimes regional and national businesses do stuff through them with the athletes. And they're providing a service that I mentioned before, 99% of the athletes don't have, which is agent type services, but they're doing it in a group format because the individual athletes don't make enough for an agent to get involved. But in group format, Valiant can generate enough revenue where it makes sense for them to be involved. And they're a great example. But that's more of what you see in NIL at the pro level happening at the college level, whereas the collectives are doing something that's really brand new that would only happen at the college level.
Is there even, with Valiant, it sounds like it's just a localized sports marketing agency. For Collective, is there even a business model beyond we just want to get as much money to these student athletes as possible and hope that there's a benefit back to the university, whether it's from a recruiting standpoint or, I mean, it seems like it's some of these collectives are just basically doing legal money laundering, I guess is the best way of saying it, rather than actually providing a real service back to the student athlete.
I think you're seeing collectives do everything they can to be more creative on how they, how they do things, how they show the value exchange. I mean, you don't have to be, you had to be Nostradamus to predict how we got from last year to this year. You don't have to be Nostradamus to predict as much how we get from this year to next year and the year after. I mean, there's still unknowns, but this is going to end up in-house. I mean, schools are going to either contract out services that, like a Learfield, they contract it out, but the GM's on campus with a team. Based on total revenue volume, the team will be different sizes. Or they'll hire staff. We're seeing schools actually name people on staff with NIL roles. So that's one thing that I think is clear. And that's why we went the route of technology, because even if the services are in-house, you need tech to make connections for deal conversations, to streamline payments and reporting, to help with brand building, regardless. The second thing that's clear is collectives are going to be regulated to an extent. The problem is you really, if it's done the right way, it's hard to regulate. Right. I mean, how can you say that if you put a dinner together for these baseball players, and these baseball players only have to show up, there's 30 tables, there's 30 players, each player has a table, and there's 9 people that are paying to go to the event to sit at the table with a player and learn about the experience of playing baseball at that school. And each of those people is going to give $1,000, and the player each makes $9,000. I don't know. I mean, that's done at the pro level.
Yeah. And that's a legitimate thing. Absolutely. Yeah.
And so I think that that's why, once again, you're on here today as student athlete NIL, and you're helping brands come into this world, but you also have student athlete empowerment, which is, I think, really important for collectives to understand what they can and can't do, right, so that they don't become part of what I think will be a dark era in college sports that we study and look back at years from now because of how some people are approaching it.
Right. Well, my opinion is, and you mentioned SAE with what we do with schools, is that the collective model of just trying to get as much dollars into the pockets of these student athletes is it's not a sustainable business model, because what's going to end up happening is that a donor puts money in, and then that money, goes to a student athlete who doesn't end up being as good as they thought they would be, or ends up transferring in a year, and that money is basically better lit on fire. So if a collective or whatever entity is doing something, they have to create a long-term return on investment for the people that are funding it, as well as for the student athlete. And so what we're trying to do is create systems and platforms for athletes to get benefits beyond just the dollars, whether that's being able to get an internship at a particular program, or doing something that they maybe otherwise couldn't because they're so busy, or because they can't take an unpaid internship, but here's a stipend that can help support them while they go pursue and get actual real world experience. That's where the value is. But it seems like, at least initially, many of these collectives have just focused on driving as many dollars as they can, specifically from a recruiting standpoint, and specifically for men's basketball, football.
Yes, on everything. And one sentence that summarizes it, or I guess a question is the money being exchanged for services that will bring value now, or is it being exchanged based on a position or role of the person that's being paid? And so, because right now, he might be QB1. But if he becomes QB2 or goes in the transfer portal and goes to another school, would you still pay that fee because of the value you got now?
Right.
And that's what everyone's watching for, because that's pay for play.
Right.
And it has to do with your title and your position, not the services and value, which is why I already kind of gave the example without saying his name. I'm going to say his name because it's a great example. Spencer Rattler was the starting quarterback at Oklahoma, did a deal with the local, I believe, Ford dealership, and then lost his job after the Texas game to Caleb Williams. And now Spencer is the assumed QB1 at South Carolina. And a lot of people wrote a lot of articles that next week saying, will he keep that deal? How does performance play into this? But the reality is that dealership got a ton of value in the weeks that Spencer promoted them through his Instagram in Norman, and it was done. Yep. And now if there's ongoing things and he transfers and stuff, that's up to them to have a good agreement and Spencer to sign the right agreement for him to protect him. I don't know that part. But what I do know is that's a legitimate NIL deal, because yeah, it had to do with him being QB1, but he exchanged services to endorse that Ford dealership that gave them value for the money they paid.
Right. And that's a risk that any brand enters into if they're, dealing with a professional athlete. The athlete can get benched, they can get hurt. And so that's part of the risk assessment. And so there needs to be, certainly, at least as it relates to the collectives and the local business community, there needs to be cooperation, probably with the school or somebody that's doing something on behalf of the school, similar to what we do at SAE, to make sure that it all meshes together and the best interests of the student athletes and the institution are being watched versus the best interest of the person putting the money into the collective.
Agreed.
So you mentioned a little bit earlier that it seems like you're predicting that some of this may move towards in-house. And can you talk a little bit more about that? I mean, obviously, we don't have federal legislation. NCAA is saying no pay for play. Most states are saying that you shouldn't be directly facilitating deals. Myself as a lawyer, I don't think that schools should be directly involved in these transactions, because that creates a whole can of worms from a liability standpoint. How do you foresee this evolving?
So I think that, first of all, I think the state of Alabama, which we're based in Birmingham and happen to know some of the folks that were involved in putting that bill together. And obviously we work with the institutions in the state. I think that bill was relaxed to help facilitation. So, am I saying that schools are going to be, brokering and negotiating deals for student athletes? Not necessarily. I think that deal making, fulfillment, and business management are three categories of a lot of actions that student athletes need help with. So even if the deal is proposed to the student athlete, the deal making side doesn't just include finding out who you should do a deal with. It's once you have the conversation, what are the terms of that deal? What's the legal setup that's proper? That kind of stuff. I think there's going to be an ability to help student athletes with that more over time. The fulfillment part, once you sign a deal, what did you sign on to do and how do you do it? And the school should be somewhat involved in this, because sites and marks are owned by the school. And in most cases at this point are not given to the student athlete to use. I think somebody's got to figure that out. And I think that's part of what I think is incentivizing the MMR to want to make introductions of the corporate sponsors of the school to student athletes for further inventories to be activated. The school to have resources to help finalize the terms of that deal and make sure the student athlete activates properly with the fulfillment of that deal. And then lastly, the business management side. I mean, you can teach student athletes how to pay their taxes. You can give them influencer and 1099 to go do it, but they still got to do it. And so to me, to have some legal resources and some accounting resources, which by the way are already on campus for other purposes, that the student athlete can take advantage of, I think is really important. I understand the liabilities of the school doing it with employees, which is why I think there may be firms that are still contractors, but they are on site to help with human services in these regards. And I think that's definitely where I see it's going. And I think commissioners and ADs have seen, maybe they didn't agree with this when it first started, but they've seen that the states and the limitations the states created with their policies have hurt the school just as much as the student athlete.
Right. Do you see, so it seems like we may be headed towards a day when at least some student athletes at universities are considered employees, and that there may be some sort of revenue share model. How does that affect NIL? I mean, does that change the business in any way, or does that just make it a little bit easier for schools to be involved? And, what are your views from that perspective?
Yeah, so the problem with pay for play, with employee status and a salary, and even media revenue sharing, that a lot of sports fans and people who are fighting for those things to happen don't realize is it may actually end up being a bad situation for the student athlete for a lot of reasons. Number one, there's a lot of tax-free dollars that the student athlete can take advantage of as part of their education right now, based on the school they go to. So I mentioned before, cost of attendance, educator-related benefits are more recent due to the Alston case, which had to do with that. Those are two checks, essentially, that some schools are allowing student athletes to collect and use towards their education that are, when you combine them together, 5 figures. Some student athletes also can get a Pell Grant based on their financial hardship. That becomes a cash thing because they have a scholarship paying for their education. Student athletes can get at some schools, I'm still kind of talking Power 5 here, but as many pairs of sneakers as they need for the basketball season. They can get as many pairs of shorts, and they have 4 trainers in the strength and conditioning room. And here's what's going to happen is schools are going to say, you get 1 strength and conditioning coach, and you're going to pay for the other 3 together as a group. You get 1 pair of sneakers and 1 replacement, and you're going to pay for any other sneakers you use. You're going to pay for your education. And right. if you think on behalf of the student athlete, NIL and the other benefits that they get on top of their scholarship will end up mathematically being a better situation for 90% of the student athletes. Maybe for the quarterback and like a few players, based on what their media revenue share would be and based on what their salary would be, it'll benefit and they'll come out on top, but a lot won't. Right. And the reason I had to tell that story first isn't just for perspective, but it's because of the fact that the only way that a student athlete can make an educated decision on that is through some bargaining mechanisms that are in place on behalf of the student athlete. Bargaining mechanisms that you see in place at the pro level through a players association. It's going to be really hard for student athletes to unionize because they go to state institutions and states have laws against that happening, and they're not going to change them for some student athletes and some institutions, not even for recruiting in the state of Alabama. So the reality is like, how are we going to collectively bargain for the student athletes so that they can make the right decision on those types of things and come out net positive? And do it also with college athletics in mind. A lot of people think that if that doesn't happen, it's against the student athletes. It could actually be for the student athletes. Should those things happen, NIL will still be an icing on the cake to their experience that will vary from athlete to athlete in the way I broke down the numbers earlier. I don't think it changes much, but it may demotivate some athletes from even doing the work that's required because they would have a salary and they would have media revenue coming in instead.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think that for 99.9% of athletes, they have a great deal, especially with NIL right now. And they would be limited to the very, basically those elite student athletes that are going to be, draft picks, even top tier draft picks, not even late round draft picks, that would make sense. But it seems like other people in the industry have their mindset on offering this to everybody. Jim, we're approaching the end to the session. Tell us what you view the next 8 months of NIL to be, and what are the next 8 years? Where is this going?
I think that right now schools are trying to figure out how they can make some of these decisions they have to make. They're running these numbers themselves. These are in pro formas and financial models on their campuses because they know that it could be coming and they need to be prepared for the conversation. And as they're doing that, they're wondering, and more people will wonder, how do we collectively bargain for the student athletes so they have a seat at the table. And I think in the next 8 to 12 months, student athletes are finally going to have a seat at the table. And some are going to have one opinion and others are going to have another opinion. And I think that's going to be really important in the next 8 to 12 months. I also think in the next 8 to 12 months, we're going to see which party controls the House. And we're going to see, you know, what happens in these midterm elections. And believe it or not, that has a lot to do with not just having a federal bill, but what the federal bill will do. And I think that's very important. And I think those two things, collective bargaining instruments for, I think, schools of student athletes, not conferences or the entire country, because this is way too wide to do like we do at pro level. I think it's probably going to be a school-focused collective bargaining instrument that comes, that starts to emerge to help the student athletes have a seat at the table. And then, you know, the politics side of it's actually very big.
Sure. And I agree with you there. I think students are going to have a seat at the table, whether or not that becomes through federal legislation, which I'm in doubt of, just because obviously there are many more important things going on in the world right now. But I think that just based on the power that student athletes have and the fact that that power is becoming more and more every day, that universities are going to have no choice but to open up the opportunity for student athletes to at least have more voice in the future of this industry. And I think we're both excited to help maybe facilitate those types of conversations between the universities, the student athletes, and all of the other stakeholders in the industry.
No doubt about it.
Awesome. Well, Jim, thank you for joining us. And I'm sure that when we have this conversation again in the year, it's going to be completely different.
Looking forward to that, Jason. Thanks for the interview. And Ryan, thanks for having me.
Likewise.
Chris,
thanks so much, guys. Yep, no worries. Yeah, before you go, we have a little bit of promotion to do. First off, I want to start off by saying we kicked off the day in an amazing way. You two are a almanac of NIL knowledge. I learned so many things today that I didn't even realize. Can't wait to chop it up with you guys more and figure out more of this whole NIL landscape. Also, the reason that us three know each other is very fortuitous, and I actually want to just take a minute and give a solid promotion. So Jason Belzer, the reason we came into each other's worlds is because we did an NIL summit last year, a little one, you know, a little virtual one. That's our second little virtual one. But this man is doing the NIL summit in person in Atlanta in June, and the official sponsor is Influencers. So I just want to take a minute, give you the floor, Jason. Please promote it, tell everybody all the details about it, because we want everyone to come out.
Sure. We're hosting the first or inaugural NIL Summit in person at the College Football Hall of Fame this June 13th through the 15th in Atlanta. We look at Atlanta as the mecca of college sports, and we are bringing between 300 to 500 student athletes from all around the country. We have some amazing folks that have already committed and are going to be putting them together with some of the biggest brands in the world, Meta, Facebook and Instagram, Wasserman, WWE, Influencer, and a lot of other big companies and organizations. And it's going to be a really cool event. Our goal is to make it what we hope will become the NIL of South by Southwest and Complex Con. And so in a couple of years, we want to have a few thousand student athletes there. So any brands or student athletes or universities that are listening to this talk, we would love to have you guys out. And if you just go to nilsummit.com, you can learn more information about signing up.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys both so much for coming on. Everybody out there, mark this on your calendar. It's going to be the NIL Summit of the year, of the century. And like you said, I think it's going to become an every year thing, and we're all going to want to go. So thank you guys again for joining us. Really appreciate it.